Hello, viewers. Once again, we resume our series of presentations from our channel, Truth for These Times. After some lapse of time, we are now going to continue in our third series on the voice of the dragon. And we just start from getting a verse from the Bible in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, and verse 11, which says, "And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And he exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and cursed the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed." In fact, when we read in the writings of Spirit of Prophecy, especially in volume 4 of the book, The Great Controversy, or the 1884 edition of the book, Great Controversy, the servant of the Lord E.G. White wrote thus: "Our land is in jeopardy. The time is drawing on when its legislators shall so abjure the principles of Protestantism as to give countenance to Romish apostasy. The people for whom God has so marvelous wrought, strengthening them to throw off the galling yoke of popery, will by a national act give vigor to the corrupt faith of Rome, and thus arouse the tyranny which only waits for a touch to start again into cruelty and despotism." One of the greatest events that will take place in our time as we close the history of the world is the enactment of the national Sunday law, which will turn out to be the international Sunday law, and which is the very climax of human history. Because as early as 1995, the powers of the world, uniting under the three agencies or the threefold union, started a series of things that were to fulfill the long-awaited prophecy. In fact, it is in 1995 that the Pope of Rome wrote the book Ut Unum Sint, that they may all be one. It is in 1995, and a year later, that a new emblem was introduced in the church that was to give the final message to the world, the remnant church, those who were given or who were entrusted with the things of God as depositaries of divine things. Because it is that same year, in 1995, that Ellen White's prediction found fulfillment when on April 19, 1995, the Alfred Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma, USA, was demolished by explosions planted by the agents of the papacy as a pretext for passing legislation purportedly in pursuit of the terrorists. And this is what Ellen White meant by telling us that about papal falsehoods and delusions. In fact, the delusions themselves were the resuscitation of the Catholic canon law that bore civil resemblance. And in fact, it is the papacy in league with the US government that has been financing terrorists in order to put statutes upon the books in preparation for the restoration of the medieval Inquisition. of which same Inquisition, when Pope Innocent III instituted a number of inquisitors, or persons who were to make inquiry and punish the reformed heretics. And after finding the inquisitors not so useful, resolved to establish fixed courts of inquisition. And many were erected in several countries, but the Spanish Inquisition became the most powerful of all of them. And in fact, the time in which we are living is a time that the image of the beasts has already been formed. It is not a time that the image of the beast is going to be formed. In fact, the image of the beast has already been formed, because we learn from the writings that it was apostasy that led the early church in the beginning to seek the aid of the civil government. And this kind of partnership prepared the way for development of the papacy, which is the beast. The Apostle Paul said, there shall come a falling away, and that man of sin be revealed. And so apostasy in the church will prepare the way for the image of the beast. So what we are saying here is that the image of the beast has already been formed, but the world thinks that the image of the beast is something that is going to be formed, because the development of history revealed to us that whatever the servant of the Lord had written about what will come to take place has already taken place. She wrote somewhere in the fifth volume of the Testimonies of the Church, and page 451, that when Protestantism shall stretch a hand across the gulf to grasp the hand of the Roman power, and when she shall reach over the abyss to grasp hands with spiritualism, when under the influence of this threefold union, our country shall repudiate every principle of its constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, and shall make provision for the propagation of papal falsehoods and delusions, then we may know that the time has come for the marvelous working of Satan, and that the end is near. The time for the marvelous working of Satan, when it actually came, was a result of the powers of the earth, the threefold union, when they had consolidated their power in the world. That is when we talk of the time of the marvelous working of Satan, a time when most of God's people who could have been aware of what is happening will be found sleeping. And this also reminds me that at a time when this church was forming early in the 1840s, this church of God was led by a servant who was to enlighten his people of what's happening all along the journey. And she somewhere wrote that when the Protestant churches themselves shall unite with the secular power to sustain a false religion, for opposing which their ancestors endured the fiercest persecution, when the state shall use its power to enforce the decrees and to sustain the institutions of the church, then will Protestant America have formed an image to the papacy. And there will be a national apostasy which will end only in national ruin. So when is the image actually formed? The image is formed by the Protestant churches when they teach all things in common. And the Bible tells us in the book of Revelation in chapter 13 that when this image will be given power to speak or to legislate, it will command all, rich and poor, slave and free, that they receive a mark. In fact, that is a coercive power that will come from the Western powers to enforce their decrees and to sustain their institutions by using the power of the state, like, for example, registering a church as a trademark and forbidding anyone else to call themselves a church or to call themselves a Seventh-day Adventist church. Many of these things have come to pass, and yet the people of God do not realize what is happening. And no wonder the servant of the Lord could write in one of the books, our writings, page 119, that I saw that the remnant were not prepared for what is coming upon the earth. Stupidity, like lethargy, seemed to hang upon the minds of those who profess to believe that we are having the very last message for this time. And my accompanying angel cried out with awful solemnity, "Get ready, get ready, get ready. For the fierce anger of the Lord is to come. His wrath is to be poured out and mixed with mercy. And ye are not ready. Rend your heart and root your garment." A great work must be done for the remnant people of God. Yes, indeed, a great work has to be done for the remnant people of God. But are the remnant people ready to do it? Are they assuming that they are preaching the three angels' messages when indeed they are not preaching? Because these three angels that we talk about represent the people who accept the light of God's messages and go forth as his agents to sound the warning throughout the length and the breadth of the earth. And it's the reason why Christ told his followers that ye are the light of the world. And therefore, for every soul that accepts Jesus, the cross of Calvary speaks, behold, the worth of the soul, the worth of the human soul. Go ye into the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And nothing is to be permitted to hinder this solemn work. Because it is the all-important work for this very time in which we are living. And it's to be far-reaching as far as eternity. So, when the time in which you are living, the whole world is preparing to enact an international law that will forbid the buying and selling. It means it is the coercive power of the enemy that will be used to silence those dissidents, to silence those who do not move in the way of the world, those who do not move in the way of the papacy, which has consolidated its power among human systems, among churches. And it's for this reason that we read in the SDA Bible Commentary, Volume 7, in the page 985 thus, that a more decided effort will be made to exalt the false Sabbath and to cast contempt upon God himself by supplanting the day he had blessed and sanctified. Where do we read that in the Bible? In the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 1 to 3, of a day that God had rested, a day that he had set aside, a day that he had sanctified. Yet the whole world hiding under a false banner and hiding under a false day of worship, which is actually a pagan holiday in celebration of the powers of the earth, will enact a law that will force men and women everywhere to obey the power of the papacy, where the power of the enemy or the power of Satan is hiding. So when we look back in the way of the time of Roman Empire, for example, in the year 312, during the Edict of Milan, which granted universal toleration for all Christians, we move again the year 321, when the first law for the worship of Sunday was published. And we move on to the year 325, when it was convened at Nice, the first ecumenical council, under Constantine. And in fact, the very process that time was the clothing of paganism with Christian garments, which was made complete during that time. And as a result, the dignity of the Senate and the people of Rome received a further blow, and they were thereafter subject alike to the insults and neglect of their master, who had actually transferred his residence to the new capital of Constantinople. And these acts of Constantine during that time started a series of movements which developed rapidly into the Antichrist of the Dark Ages. And the law he issued during that time said that let all the churches and the town people and the occupation of all trades rest on the venerable day of the sun. But let those who are situated in the country freely and at full liberty attend the business of agriculture, because it often happens that no other day is so fit for sowing corn and planting vines. Let the critical moment of being let slip, men should lose the commodities granted by heaven. In fact, this was the origin of Sunday law that was enacted by Constantine to force all men and women to worship on the venerable day of the sun. So, during the time of Constantine, paganism and Christianity had met on a battlefield, and he contended himself, Constantine, for the throne of Rome. And paganism and Christianity made a mere deadly conflict in Alexandria, because it is here in Alexandria where Christian and pagan schools stood side by side. Here it was that such a man as Origen and Clement, recognized fathers of the church, as we read in history, adopted the philosophy of the Greeks and applied to the study of the Bible the same methods which were common in the study of Homer and other Greek writers, of whom we see Paul quoting in the book of Acts of the Apostles, the man who wrote to the unknown God. And higher criticism that we see also in theological colleges today had its birth in Alexandria, where the pagans doubted the words of the inspiration of the Bible. And in fact, it was a result of the mingling of the truths that were taught by Christ and the false philosophy of the Greeks. And this philosophy was an attempt to divine writings by the human intellect, a revival of the philosophy of Plato, the great Greek philosopher. These teachers, by introducing Greek philosophy into the schools which were nominally Christian, opened the avenue for many theological controversies which shook the Roman world and finally established the mystery of iniquity. And these controversies were not confined merely to the Roman world, but we find them even in our churches today, people arguing about the position of Christ, people arguing about the position of the Trinity, because these things are things they are borrowed from the past. These are things they are borrowed from the past. But we know very clearly in our time that when the image of the beast is formed in our very time, the very image that will command all rich and poor, the image is formed as a result of what Ellen White writes for us in the book Great Controversy. For example, in page 445, she writes thus: when the leading churches of the United States, uniting upon such a points of doctrine as are held by them in common, shall influence the state to enforce their decrees and to sustain their institutions, then Protestant America will have formed an image of the Roman hierarchy, and the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result. How are these civil penalties coming upon dissenters? In the same manner that we see in Rwanda, where the head of state can say people who have not gotten the certificates from theological colleges are not supposed to hold gatherings, are not to officiate in worship. These very things, These very things which are happening in our time. When we talk about the United States of America, which is mentioned in the prophecy in the book of Revelation chapter 13 and verse 11, we see a power in the world, a great power in the world that will influence the whole world to disobey God. And it is a result of this great war against the people of God that we will find a people who will be true to God. We will find a people who will not swerve from their allegiance, their Creator. And the Bible tells us about such a people in the book of Revelation, chapter 14, verse 12, thus, here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Where do we find such a people? A people who, amidst the terrible apostasy that is in the world today, who will stand firm and say, we want to defend truth and righteousness. Because we know that the whole Protestant world, after having apostatized, will throw the whole influence and strength on their side of the papacy. And by a national act, enforcing the full Sabbath, they will give life and vigor to the corrupt faith of Rome, reviving her tyranny and the oppression of conscience. And this is why the power that deceived the men of the earth, by false miracles, is soon becoming a police state. Many things have happened. Many things have already happened that will prepare the world for the great persecution, which is a revival of the great Inquisition. In fact, in many places of the world, not just in the US, detention camps or concentration camps have been put in place. In many places of the world is putting emphasis on the use of smart cards and electronic money. In the places of the world, communication is curtailed. In the places of the world, many of the resources that the people have used are being kept away from the hands of God's faithful people. So it is a time like this. It is at a time like this that God will work among his people in a strange manner. A time is coming when the commandment keepers of God cannot buy or sell. They cannot do anything. And that's why when that time comes, when the world is going to force the people of the world to walk in its way, many of God's people will flee from the large cities into small villages. And that's why the siege that came upon Jerusalem by the Roman armies was a signal for the flight of the Judean Christians. And also, in the same manner, in our own time, the assumption of power on the part of the great nation of the world, that's the United States of America, in issuing a decree enforcing the purple Sabbath, that's the first day of the week, will be a warning to all God's faithful people that the time has come for them to flee from the cities, preparatory to fleeing even smaller ones for retired homes in secluded places among the mountains. And in the provisions of God, many of God's people will secure places that are very far from the cities. And God, when troublous times will come, they will be saved from the wave that will come upon the whole world. So the purple Sabbath, or the invention of Sunday, which is actually a symbol of a method of salvation by works, a method that is contrary to the way of God, is a system that will force the whole world to walk in the way of man, not in the way of God. So Sunday is to accept a human work that is contrary to the divine command of God in heaven. Sunday is to accept a method of salvation that is contrary to the method that God has put in place. Sunday is a pagan holiday that is celebrating the power of the Trinity. And the power of the Trinity is a resuscitation of the power of the enemy who sinned in heaven in the beginning, who has brought so many corruptions in the church during our time, that the church is so corrupted and people don't even realize that we are living in the time of the end. In fact, when we read a book like The Great Controversy, page 248, the 1911 edition, we find something very interesting. Now I will ask a strange question, said Latimer. Who is the most diligent bishop and prelate in all England? I see you listening and hearkening that I should name him. I will tell you, it is the devil. He is never out of his diocese. Call for him when you will. He is ever at home. He is ever at his plow. You shall never find him idle. I warrant you. Where the devil is resident, there away with books, and up with candles, away with Bibles, and up with beads, away with the light of the gospel, and up with the light of candles, even at noonday. That's what we read in the book of The Great Controversy. How many times have we seen, even in our churches, candles being introduced, and the people don't want to heed even the writings of the spirit of prophecy? People have come with ideas that we need to read the Bible and the Bible alone. While the writings of the spirit of prophecy are a lesser light, they are so important to guide us in our journey to the kingdom of glory. In fact, we do find in our systems, we do find in our churches, people who are so given over to the power of Satan completely, and yet who pretend that they are messengers of the gospel of God. Because these such a kind of people, whenever they talk about such important issues, like the ministration of Christ in the sanctuary, they don't reveal to the people of God that which they should know. They don't reveal to the people of God about the ministration of the sanctuary. They just pass by it, just by mentioning. They don't want to dwell about the great work where God's people will be cleansed of all manner of sin. But when the servant of God, Ellen White, talks about these things that are happening in the sanctuary, she teaches us plainly that when the books of record are opened in the judgment of the heaven, the lives of all who have ever believed in Christ Jesus will come in review before God. And beginning with those who first lived upon the earth, our advocate presents the cases of each successful generation and closes with the cases of the living. Why? Every name has to be mentioned and every case has to be closely investigated, because at the end of the day, names will be accepted and names will be rejected. These important messages that prepare the people of God for what is going to transpire in the world, these important messages which prepare the people of God for what is to transpire in the world, they are very messages that are meant to make God's people obtain the righteousness, and which same righteousness alone that will enable them to escape the judgments that will come. Most of these messages are kept away from God's people. In fact, those who do it, we call them obscurantists. They obscure that should be made plain. Because the people of God at a time like this, the times which we are living, need to know that if they have sins remaining upon the books of record, and repented and unforgiven, as is stated in the writings of the spirit of prophecy, their names will be blotted out of the book of life, and the record of their good deeds will be erased from the book of God's remembrance. In fact, that is what happened even during the time of Moses, when he was saying, whoever had sinned against me, him will I blot out of my book. Exodus chapter 32 in the verse 33. And the prophet Ezekiel also said that when the righteous turneth away from his righteousness and committed iniquity, or his righteousness shall not be mentioned. So when you turn away from following in the way of God and follow in the way of the Lord, you no longer count in the matters of the kingdom of God. So what we are saying here is that the spirit of coercion that will come from the power of Rome is a spirit that started way back in the beginning. And if you are not making any compromises now, If you're preparing your soul for eternity, you will not make any compromises regarding your faith, because at the end of time, you will receive the mark of the beast and you will enter into eternal condemnation. So what we are telling the people of God at this time is that it is a time for them to examine their lives. It is a time they have to follow Christ to the throne of grace. It's a time they have to confess their sins. It's a time they have to prepare for the great climax of history, which is the Sunday law that will be enacted by the United States of America, and it will go to the whole world, and it will involve every child of Adam in this world. It's a time now that we should prepare ourselves for eternity. This message is now coming from our channel, Truth for These Times, will continue to be heard all over the world. For those who have subscribed to this channel, you will continue to hear these wonderful messages. And we want to tell all who have been subscribing to this channel that be ready to hear many wonderful messages as we prepare for eternity. Welcome.